Last time I went over most of the non-Paladin specific stuff the Burning Crusade brought to the table. Now it's time to go over the Paladin specific stuff. One of the most important things the Burning Crusade did for the Paladin class, for all three specs mind, was that we got a cosmetic boost that we didn't even realize we needed. For one thing, in vanilla, our judgment debuffs used the fairy fire animation. That's right, we were attacking mobs with friggin' butterflies. Seals all looked the same too, using the inner fire animation which still survives today with Seal of Righteousness. All things considered, in vanilla, Paladins were probably the least impressive class visually. The Burning Crusade changed all that. Each seal got a unique animation, and Judgment went from butterflies to the iconic hammer-on-head animation we know and love today. And while today Paladins have some visually impressive things they can dish out, I think a few of our animations need to be revisited. Holy Shock's animation looks like Vanilla's Judgment of Righteousness all over again. Hammer of Wrath uses the old Judgment of Justice impact animation instead of the golden explosion it did in Vanilla. And then there's Glyph of Harsh Words. It uses Smite's animation. Honestly, they can do better. What really brought this please redo some Paladin animations thing on was how Crusaders look in Diablo 3. I could do a whole nother video on how Warcraft and Diablo have cross-pollinated over the years, to be honest, but what really made me jealous about Crusaders were two things. First of all, they don't have all the class design problems Paladins had in vanilla, because Blizzard has clearly learned a lot from their mistakes in WoW. And secondly, how visually impressive Crusader abilities were. I think Holy Shock could use a good Lightning from Heaven animation like Fist of Heaven has. You know, just imagine how Paladin abilities would look if the same effort were put into them as was put into the Crusader. Flash of Light would have holy rays jumping out of every wound, disappearing as the wounds closed, Crusader Strike would crackle with holy lightning, and even Cleanse would look impressive. While we're on the subject of the Paladin's Cleanse spell, other than cleansing, Paladins were all about buffs in vanilla, and they were not much different in the Burning Crusade. We gained 3 new abilities and some buffs to existing abilities. In particular, added to our Seal and Judgment system were Seal of Blood and Seal of Vengeance. They were both holy damage seals, and as such they were kind of redundant with Command and Righteousness. But no one really cared about redundancy back then. Mostly useless abilities and talents sort of came with the territory, and we just ignored them. While there was some debate at the time about whether straight-up 30% more damage per swing with some health cost was better or worse than a stacking debuff that boosted Judgment's damage, no one really complained about redundancy, and Blizzard wasn't yet worried about bloated spell bars. What people's attention was fixed on was instead something that Blizzard said would never come, an honest-to-goodness strike ability. At first, Blizzard was going to put a buff at the top of Retribution. Again. When they got negative feedback about that, they finally bit the bullet and gave us Crusader Strike. But Crusader Strike was still a supplement to the Seal system. Even with the strike ability added, nothing much changed for the Retribution spec. There was still very little ranged for them, and Crusader Strike was even described as a controllable Seal of Command proc. There is one Paladin spec that changed a lot, and that was Protection. Blizzard was finally serious about allowing Paladins to tank. They gave Protection an on-demand ability. It was called Avenger's Shield, and at the time it had a 1-second cast. It dealt a good chunk of damage, and it dazed targets, and it was great for pulling. But it had a kind of a long cooldown. They also gave Protection an actual taunt, albeit one that you cast on an ally, not one you cast on enemies. That taunt was available at a pretty low level, and so was a passive ability called Spiritual Attunement, which gave the Paladin mana whenever he was healed. The fact that those were available at a low level really showed that Blizzard wanted Paladins to tank even older content. And since Paladins had to do holy damage in order to generate threat, Blizzard finally did what they should have done in the patch 1.9 and dropped Consecration down to a trainable ability. And Blizzard started cranking out gear that would be good for Protection. At the time it had spell power on it, but, well, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So Retribution and Protection got some shiny new abilities. What did Holy get? Well, they kind of got a consolation prize. Their heals remained efficient, but no new heals were added. Holy Shock's cooldown was dropped from 30 seconds to 15 seconds in lieu of getting a new button to click, and we got a new cooldown called Divine Illumination. I never really explained Holy's cooldowns in vanilla, so I'll explain them here. Vanilla's version of Divine Favor was a lot different from today's. Vanilla's version was a 2-minute cooldown. It was a button that you clicked, and then your next Holy Light, Flash of Light, or Holy Shock was guaranteed to crit. This was great with the Illumination passive. Besides Divine Favor, we had Lay on Hands, which, like today, healed for 100% of the Paladin's HP, but back then it completely emptied his mana bar when he used it. And on top of that, it had a 1-hour cooldown. I'm not even joking. Blessing of Protection was pretty much the same as Hand of Protection in that it stopped all incoming and outgoing physical damage. Those were the vanilla cooldowns. The Burning Crusade added Divine Illumination, which was, for several seconds, the mana cost of your spells is cut in half. I almost never used this one. All Paladins got Avenging Wrath, which at the time increased all the damage the Paladin deals by 30%. At this time, it did not actually increase your healing, so it wasn't really one of Holy's cooldowns. The only other ability we got was, you guessed it, another aura. Crusader aura arrived in the Burning Crusade, and while it didn't help us in combat, it did help us while questing to get from point A to point B faster. On the whole, Paladins were still the same class, albeit with a few quality of life improvements, but it honestly felt like other classes were getting ahead, and Paladins were being brought up to par with the way those classes were in vanilla. Now, I promised to discuss hybridization. The talent system in vanilla, the Burning Crusade, and Wrath allowed players to put some points in one tree, some in another, and some in a third. Specs weren't decided at level 10. Your spec was whichever tree you happened to have the most points in at any given time. There were some nifty abilities in the talent trees, and in fact, our best abilities were generally found there. Some of them were versatile and any spec could make use of them, some were needed to perform the function of the tree, and some were just plain nice things to have that helped you do your job better if you were that spec. Of course, some talented abilities were just plain good utility that only one spec could get, too. Theoretically with this system, you could spec yourself to be tankier or healer-ier if you wanted to. In reality, most of the important tools for being able to function were buried pretty deep in the trees, making hybridization more and more difficult as the game progressed. I'm not sure whether this was because Blizzard needed to put cool stuff helpful for the spec deep in the trees whenever they released new content, or because hybrids weren't happy that they couldn't do their jobs as well as pure classes were, and hybridization wasn't something Blizzard wanted to encourage anymore. Of course, all of this didn't just apply to Paladins. Every class could choose to put their talent points toward anything in their trees. If you want to have a look at how it all worked, there are links in the description to a few old-school World of Warcraft talent tools that will let you have a look. The fact that there were so many talents and so many possible combinations is one of the things that lent WoW from back then a figure-it-out-yourself vibe. Players were allowed, if not encouraged, to experiment with the talent systems and find out what works for them. It was extremely rare, but nevertheless possible, for a player to discover a build that was miles ahead of pure specs by experimenting with the system. It could and did happen, and it wouldn't be possible with the current system of specs and talents. I think one of the main reasons Blizzard switched to the current system was that utility abilities that any spec could benefit from, but which Blizzard still wanted to be choices, were one spec only with the old talent system. The new system probably gives players more playstyle choices than the old one, although I do miss the idea of being able to switch roles during a battle as the battle evolves. If Blizzard wanted to bring back hybridization and allow formerly hybrid classes a chance to customize themselves to fit half one spec, half another, then I wouldn't mind seeing those days return, though the devil isn't in the details there, the whole Burning Legion is in the details. The fact is, for the game to reward hybridization, it can't just be changes to class design. The environment you're playing those classes in will also need to be designed to reward bringing a tank and a half or a healer and a half along for your run. And the things Blizzard would need to do to WoW to make that happen are pretty frightening. Though, if they created a dynamic dungeon design system where they change the mobs depending on what hybrids are along, that might actually make it work. Before I get into how engineering changed in the Burning Crusade, I think I should say something about professions in general. Since it was so hard to get into raids and heroics, often profession-made gear was the best anyone can get, and that created a lot of demand. So in some ways, crafting profession's heyday was the Burning Crusade. And Blizzard started codifying a lot of things that would go into future expansions. First of all, they invented something called primal nethers. Primal nethers would drop from dungeon bosses in heroics, and they were used for crafting high-end gear. At first, they were bind-on pickups, so you had to go into heroics to even make that high-end gear. After Blizzard's quality of life improvements kicked in, they became tradable, and now anybody who can afford one on the auction house can make that gear. But future expansions held on to the concept that there should be an item that drops from heroics, which players need in order to craft good gear. Blizzard also introduced jewel crafting and the concept of 6 different colors of gems and metagems. These were very relevant to engineering because a lot of engineering items required gems to make, not the least of which was purple-level engineering goggles. While there were quite a few goggles in vanilla for engineers, these goggles were class and spec specific. For instance, as a Holy Paladin, I could make spellplate goggles. Every expansion since the Burning Crusade has had these specialized goggles at the end of engineering's progression, and it has been very rewarding and very iconic. Another thing that Blizzard codified with the Burning Crusade was the concept of motes and elements. In vanilla, there were various elemental crafting items, such as essence of fire, essence of air. Generally, those things dropped off of elementals and had a very low chance to drop. Apparently, farming those was a little bit too frustrating. So Blizzard changed the system of how elements drop, so that if you get 10 lesser elemental items called motes, you can put them together into a larger elemental item called a primal. Once you get 10 motes of earth, you can put them together into primal earth. It worked the same way with motes of fire and primal mana, primal water, primal air, and also primal life and primal shadow. This system of motes and primals was crystallized in the Burning Crusade, no pun intended on how it was in Wrath of the Lich King, but the point is it stuck around for a while and was codified in the Burning Crusade. So what was engineering specifically like in the Burning Crusade? Well, it was pretty much more of the same in terms of what we had in vanilla. We still had a variety of bombs, some of them were pretty novel, but while gnomish engineering and goblin engineering were pretty much on par with each other in vanilla, gnomish engineering really began to suck. Goblins got a rocket launcher for a trinket, and we got a polymorpher. Goblins got a really big bomb, we got a flame turret, which wasn't anywhere near worth the material costs. There wasn't anything near as awesome as the gnomish death ray. To be honest, I'm thinking that that might have been part of a bigger shift in Blizzard's philosophy about what items could do. Many items in vanilla had lots of chance-on-hit effects, or could be clicked to make something happen. Not so in the Burning Crusade or most later expansions. They were few and far between. Engineering was all about items that did something when you clicked on them, so it may well be that engineering got fewer things that did stuff in combat because of this shift in philosophy. The problem is, Blizzard didn't really do enough to take engineering away from being a make items that freaking do something to help you fight kind of a profession and turn it into a crafting profession. But I am getting a little bit ahead of myself. Pretty much it was more of the same in the Burning Crusade. All in all, I have to say that the Burning Crusade was kind of like a bridge. While it had a lot in common with vanilla, it also had a lot in common with future expansions that would make the game more accessible, more fun, more rewarding, and more popular. We'll look into another of those expansions and a moment that a decade of Warcraft lore was leading up to next time, when we examine Wrath of the Lich King.